Graphics technology continues to evolve. Along with new graphics techniques, with the buzzword of 2020 being hardware-based ray tracing, we also see an increase in memory bandwidth, ALUs, or shaders if you prefer, clock frequencies, amount of memory on the card, and so on and so on. The reality is though, it's not just a case of keep cranking up the performance of the card, but also smart utilization of the resources of the hardware. To that end, let's compare the pixel difference between a 4K and 1080p image. You are looking at literally 4 times the number of pixels, around 2 million for 1080p and around 8 million pixels for a 4K image. Clearly, that is a massive difference in the amount of work that the GPU needs to perform to essentially render the game, even if the quality settings remain identical between the two resolutions. Historically, the X60 and X70 class GPUs from Nvidia have represented the best value and bang for buck for gamers. They have great performance, but they don't hurt your bank account as much as picking up the X80 class GPUs, for example. But there have been some very interesting trends in the industry. The aforementioned shift to hardware-based ray tracing is not exactly light on GPU resources. I'll be delving much deeper into how hardware-based ray tracing works and also how Turing handles it in an upcoming video, although I will touch on it of course in this video simply because it is so close to the subject matter of DLSS. But there's also the move to higher resolution panels. 1440p is becoming a lot more popular recently, and to compound that problem, you also have gamers also wanting to crank games to 144, 165 Hz, all of which of course means a lot more work for the GPU. Indeed, there's a really good argument that even the mighty RTX 2080 Ti is best served pushing a 1440p high refresh rate panel. It means that you can drive just about every AAA experience at high frame rates, which honestly, a lot of titles now, if you're trying to strive for native resolution, is just not possible to achieve on a single RTX 2080 Ti. Games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, even if you don't have hardware-based ray tracing, are extremely demanding at such resolutions. So, what's the answer then? Well, I kind of let it slip earlier, didn't I? DLSS, or Deep Learning Super Sampling. It debuted with Nvidia's RTX 20 series of graphics cards, with the Tensor Cores of Nvidia's Turing architecture being used to run AI to upsample the image from a lower resolution to whatever output you're aiming for. Nvidia had been experimenting with both still and video reconstruction for a number of years, and indeed had put out a few demos of this technology. I and other analysts had wondered whether this would eventually be used for games. And of course, the answer is yes. Nvidia's AI upsampling technology uses the tried and true principles of deep learning, training and inference. With training, Nvidia uses an AI network called a convolutional autoencoder. It essentially takes a low-resolution rendered game frame and then compares this against a frame which was previously rendered in high resolution, 4K. It can then analyze it on a pixel-by-pixel basis to figure out what it needs to do to turn the lower quality image into the higher one. If you know anything about neural networks, the network needs to know if it's right. So, therefore, a 16K reference image is used to compare the upsampled results with. Basically, it will try and fail to match what the image looks like. Try and fail, try and fail, try and fail, and so on hundreds, if not actually thousands of times before eventually it hears back, actually, yeah, that's a pretty good match, well done you. So to this end, the now trained AI code can now run on Tensor Cores on Nvidia's graphics cards. All of this sounds impressive, but what has actually changed fundamentally between the DLSS 1 implementation and the updated DLSS implementation? Lots of things. For one, Nvidia claimed that this new network is far more generic. That is, a specific type of network is not required per game, meaning it's far easier to get a new title DLSS 2.0 ready. And more importantly, it also requires less time as well. They can just reuse the existing network, which of course ever improves, rather than needing to start from largely ground zero. Another big change is that accuracy doesn't eat much into the performance. Indeed, quite frequently the performance is about even with the earlier implementation. We'll talk about that more in depth in a moment, thanks to the Tensor Cores of the Turing architecture being better used. As we keep saying on this channel, it's not just about the raw performance, but how best to leverage it. By far though, the biggest difference is both image quality and user customization. The original DLSS was, well, honestly pretty limited, with users being forced to choose specific resolutions with the graphics card. So, the big change then is that DLSS has a lot more options, it's far more customizable. Furthermore, DLSS can now upsample from the base resolution 4 times. So for example, 1080p can become 4K, 720p can become 1440p. Given 1080p screens are still extremely popular, but also there's a surge of 1080p screens which are higher refresh rate, as well as lots of high refresh rate 1440p panels, this flexibility for DLSS is very interesting. Running a fully ray-traced game at a base resolution of say 720p, and then having this upsampled to 1440p at high refresh rates on a lower end card, such as Nvidia's X60 series, is definitely exciting, and I believe that this will be a key critical weapon in allowing cheaper cards to compete in an aggressive, graphically intensive market. Perhaps the craziest claim of Nvidia though is the notion of 540p being possible to upscale to 1080p and being comparable to a native 1080p image. Those are lofty claims to be sure. Think of it this way, just for some context. 540p is not too dissimilar to the kind of resolutions that a PlayStation 2 era game would be outputting. And even the Xbox 360, when things got really tough, same for the PlayStation 3, developers would often decide to lower the output resolution to around 600p to afford more GPU performance for effects. So, just 540p then to upscale to 1080p, that's 4 times the increase in resolution. In theory though, this would be very exciting for gamers. We are strictly, of course, sticking to the theoretical here, but imagine a $150–160 card which was capable of hardware-based ray tracing and yes, was natively rendering the title at 540p, but DLSS was upsampling it to 1080p, so you would have a high refresh rate, 1080p experience, essentially identical to a native 1080p image, albeit with, once again, hardware-based ray tracing possible because of the performance saved by rendering internally only at 540p, but critically at a high refresh rate as well. Keeping to theory, this would actually be an amazing thing for people who are into competitive FPS, for example. Ray tracing would allow enemy shadows to be much more accurately cast, so you would get some excellent positional data of if a foe was really hiding behind a corner. Or imagine you're creeping around a battlefield and then, what's that you see? Someone approaching you from behind and you just see just a hint of their reflection in the car window. You would never be able to really achieve this with traditional screen space technology, so this would be extremely exciting. Once again, critically, if this technology was possible on a card which cost $150–200 and output at a decent high frame rate, well, yeah, I think that's pretty amazing. For testing, I'd like to thank ASRock for providing a Phantom Z390 motherboard, and also MSI and Zotac for coming to the rescue and offering an RTX 2060 Super and an RTX 2070 Super for testing, respectively. Intel has also donated an i9-9900K for this purpose, and I'd also like to thank you, yes you, for supporting us on Patreon and keeping us with updated equipment. For example, the RTX 2080 Ti, which I used a little bit for this video, but largely the lower end offerings from MSI and Zotac, as I feel that that was more in range of what a lot of people would want to use DLSS for. But as I said, the 2080 Ti was purchased with your assistance, and we've also used it to buy other equipment, so thanks very much for all of your support. But let's start, as always, at the beginning, which of course was the first iteration of DLSS. It was a piece of technology which honestly I felt had lots of promise, but just did not hit the expectations we had for it, which I admit were fairly lofty, not least of which of course was Nvidia's aggressive marketing. The image quality for one was just too soft, and I really hope that you're a fan of sub-pixel artifacts because you are certainly going to get it. Character hair, finer details such as air vent covers, flickering flames did not look right, transparencies, fine detail, objects in motion could all look just a bit off. But really it did depend on A, this game, and B, the scene, on how the final constructed image looked. For example, Shadow of the Tomb Raider was a title which was heavily used to push DLSS technology, and other than looking soft in some detail, it looks fairly decent. Take these rocks here. You can see that some of the finer detail is lost when DLSS is applied, but you can also say the same for these branches as well. Hair can also look better, especially in areas of higher contrast even when DLSS is applied, as it can actually help smooth out the strands on Lara's noggin. Ray tracing in Shadow of the Tomb Raider has several different settings, so if you're not a fan of DLSS, you could reduce the ray tracing quality a few notches and still benefit greatly from the effect. Ray tracing in Shadow of the Tomb Raider can look exceptional. For example, look at the difference standing close to this huge brazier, with light bouncing and scattering on different surfaces. Frankly, the non-ray traced image looks fairly flat in comparison. Battlefield 5 was also another title heavily used to advertise Nvidia's upcoming technology. Fortunately, Nvidia and DICE worked tirelessly to at least update the code and drivers, which has improved visual quality and performance. Overall, I do think that Battlefield 5 benefits quite heavily from the performance saved with DLSS with ray tracing on. The visuals again do look blurrier, softer than expected, and texture details on trees, rocks and other surfaces just don't quite have the punch. And at further details, well, you can see the effects yourself. It doesn't look bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it just doesn't quite look as good as the native image. But I do think that the improvement by simply enabling ray tracing, I do believe that that is actually worth the trade-off for the slight softness of DLSS. Frankly, there's a lot of other games that we could examine here, but I think honestly the problems of the original DLSS as well as its positives are pretty widely documented, and frankly I don't think it's really the story of where this video should be going, because that was the past and this video is focused on the future, DLSS 2. The goal here is instead to compare how Control, with its update from DLSS 1 to 2, looks, and also to see just how Wolfenstein Youngblood compares against the native resolution. Control is possibly one of the most impressive looking games ever to grace the PC, and that is saying something. The sheer number of destructible objects and geometry, the beautiful art design, impressive character models, and honestly, the whole world is just lush with impressive attention to detail. But really, with hardware-based ray tracing, the Federal Bureau of Control's office environment just comes to life. Panes of glass reflect on one another, creating subtle, moody lighting. Shadows are cast from off-screen objects way more accurately than can ever be achieved with technology such as screen space reflections and shadow maps. But, of course, this comes with a hefty frame rate price. Ray tracing in Control does have several options which can be used to toggle on and off to save performance. But even at 1080p, a card such as an RTX 2060 Super with all the bells and whistles enabled can struggle to maintain the frame rate. Users then have a choice. With the older DLSS implementation of Control, they could run ray tracing disabled, or perhaps they could just cut back some of the ray tracing functionality, which does, yes, reduce the overall aesthetic, but hey, you do have a higher frame rate, and you don't have the image problems of Control. But honestly, I personally just would rather put up with some of the niggles of DLSS 1 and have ray tracing enabled. Especially for my setup, I generally play on a larger screen, sit further away from it, but it was a compromise. This was not a cake you can have, and you can also eat it. You can see examples here as I've been talking about the softness of the image, how the grills of the fan just become, well, a pixely looking mess, how Jess's hair just fades into pixel-based obscurity and just doesn't hold a candle to the native resolution image. So, with all of the claims from Nvidia, I must admit, I had a lot of excitement, but I was also dubious. Their claims were pretty lofty. I mean, Nvidia are claiming that the image can look as good, if not better, than a native rendered resolution. So I loaded up the game, already honestly having a crap ton of DLSS 1 footage, as originally this video had been intended to launch prior to the announcement of DLSS 2. I immediately noticed the difference in her hair in the opening cutscene. I was skeptical. Cutscenes are consistent each time you play the game. It's a lot easier, theoretically anyway, to get right compared to you actually playing around in the game itself and freely able to adjust camera angles, look at different objects and wander around the bureau. But, honestly, my skepticism was quickly put to rest. The desk fan and telephone at the beginning of the game serve as a great example, as we can easily see how much better the mesh cage surrounding the fan is depicted, no longer looking like some pixel mush. Jess's face and hair also manages to hold up better in cutscenes, and of course, much the same could be said of the supporting cast. The hair of characters, as I stated, is much better, but the skin is also much more realistic. It doesn't look so porcelain, so doll-like, with fine details such as skin pores intact, and honestly, it does a pretty good job. The game is not perfect though. There are instances where things are just not properly upsampled and rendered correctly. This can be particularly true of artwork, which can break down in visual quality at certain angles and then can fix itself from becoming a jumbled mess once again. The game is largely set in an urban environment, but there are a number of trees, shrubs, greenery all hanging around the bureau. And the large tree nearer the start of the game is particularly taxing for DLSS to get right, to render correctly. Leaves, branches, particularly those further away it seems, at best not particularly great with DLSS 1. You can see largely though the detail is preserved and look pretty damn good with DLSS 2. For my money, it's not quite up to what you could see with the native resolution, but still a vast improvement over the initial implementation. But Nvidia didn't stop there. They made claims that 540p was comparable in quality to native 1080p with DLSS 2. Well, does it work? The answer is pretty well. 540p is of course only 1/4 the pixel count of 1080p. That's 960 by 540, which is around 500,000 pixels, compared to 2 million-ish of 1080p. For context, which is always important here, this resolution is much closer to what you would expect from a PS2 game or some PS3/Xbox 360 title. Remember, many of those ran at 600p to save GPU resources. Here, we have a relatively sharp looking image which retains much of the detail you'd expect to see on a native 1080p presentation. But I won't sugarcoat things here. The lower resolution does create challenges. The good news is, overall, DLSS 2 does a pretty decent job, and I suspect most people wouldn't really notice things during action sequences. Check out the hair as you first pick up the gun with this bright white background. Versus the 720p upscaling, there's quite a difference. Meanwhile, on angled surfaces, there's rendering errors, and also, what's going on with the floor as we head towards the director's office at the start of the game. You can see yourself the lines on the floor which just fade in and out as you get closer, issues which are just not present in either the native resolution or the higher resolution DLSS upsampling. Fortunately, these problems aren't super common, and they are there and combined with artifacts around surfaces in general. The text on signs definitely gets hard to read, particularly at angles, And I know I'm sounding pretty hard on DLSS 2 here, but quite frankly, given the measly starting resolution, it's doing a pretty amazing job. The results are, though, pretty impressive overall. For upsampling from say 1080p to 4K, it's a totally different ballgame. 1080p is already a pretty good number of pixels, so there's a pretty good base to start off with. DLSS 2 has more to work with. Running a card such as an RTX 2080 Super or 2080 Ti and upsampling to a higher frame resolution such as 1440p or 4K, though with a 2080 you may need to tweak settings if you're a stickler for 4K 60fps, it is nothing short of impressive. Control is an extremely demanding game to run with ray tracing enabled, so definitely trying to push 4K visuals with a native image, it's going to be challenging at best. While the headline event was Control, I also did want to touch on Wolfenstein Young Blood. Unfortunately, the game shipped with DLSS 2. Well, okay, unfortunately for us in terms of the comparison, but fortunately for those who were playing the game at launch. No one involved in the game's development, Machine Gun Games or Nvidia, announced that we were looking at a new version of DLSS exactly, but it was pretty clear early on that there were some radical differences with Nvidia's technology just because of how big of a visual upgrade it seemed to be. The game naturally allows you to select the output resolution, 1440p, 4K, whatever, and then you get to choose an internal quality of DLSS, which really bumps things like the base resolution and a few other settings which DLSS has to work with. There are 3 settings you can choose from: quality, performance, and balanced. I would probably wager that the majority of gamers would be unable to tell if DLSS was running with quality versus a native resolution if the two scenes were side by side on 2 different systems. Yes, there are certainly subtle clues if you really scour the edges, especially if you zoom in, but really and truly this is not a situation which really presents itself in play. It's Wolfenstein and you need to keep mobile and avoid massive mechanical monstrosities, maniacal malevolence. The great thing is though that the game is super optimized already, so an RTX 2060 Super with DLSS enabled can do a reasonable job at 4K, but high refresh rate is certainly possible if you're only aiming for 1440p. A drawback of DLSS though is you cannot have, once again, your cake and eat it with 2 performance saving measures. Much has been made, of course, of variable rate shading, VRS, though Nvidia, with Wolfenstein, they were supporting it prior to DirectX 12's Ultimate's announcement, and they are using the technology known as NAS, Nvidia Adaptive Shading. In your mind, you can essentially say the 2 things are identical, but what you can't do is have VRS, NAS, enabled with DLSS, so for those wondering, you cannot claw back even more frames a second with this iteration anyway. For those wondering, is it better to have NAS enabled or DLSS? The answer is it depends on the target frame rate on your machine. NAS does claw back frames per second to be sure. Again, you can configure how aggressive it is, but on average you're looking at maybe 10ish%, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. On heavier scenes it certainly can be a little more, on lighter scenes 10%-ish is typical. With lots of explosions, lots of chaos, you can certainly therefore expect a bigger difference. But I'm using the built-in benchmark, and so it's going to be a little less than perhaps heavier scenes would provide. But I'm only touching on VRS, NAS, right now, because quite frankly it's a whole different topic and I want to save it for the future. Compared to VRS, NAS, whatever you want to call it, DLSS on quality is a huge performance advantage. You can save around 30 to 40%, depending once again on the scene. So that's around 3 to 4 times an increase in performance over VRS or NAS with this specific implementation. So let's come to some type of conclusion then. The funny thing is, I'd actually already written the script, largely edited it, and had been almost ready to put the video out, and then I started to hear rumours of DLSS 2, and of course then I waited for official confirmation from Nvidia, and we also saw subsequent implementation on various titles, including, for us anyway, most critically, Control. In my original conclusion, I had said that the technology was really exciting, it had a lot of potential, but it just wasn't quite there yet, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Soft image quality, quite frankly sub-pixelville, it just didn't quite look right. Experiences would vary depending on the title, depending on the scene, and of course depending on the native resolution, which was also kind of an issue, as I mentioned. Depending on the card that you would have, different resolutions would be available. It was one of those, great in theory, in practice your mileage will certainly vary. However, with DLSS 2, well, I think the results here are pretty much speaking for themselves. I want to make it abundantly clear that this video is not sponsored by Nvidia. All opinions here are my own. The only hardware that I've been sent is from MSI and Zotac, who have sent over an RTX 2060 Super and an RTX 2070 Super to help me conduct these tests. So, lots of thanks to them, but this is certainly not sponsored, and I actually approached them to send me over the hardware. Just to be really clear, they did not approach me here and ask me to come to any type of conclusions. But, at least in my personal opinion, I think that DLSS 2 is extremely impressive, and quite frankly, I am extremely excited to see what the future will hold with graphics just not needing to output such high resolutions and instead letting DLSS do its thing. The neural networks at Nvidia are clearly improving, and currently it's still not perfect. We've gone over the flaws already of DLSS 2, or at least some of them. There's certainly more that I haven't covered here because obviously different games, different implementations, different resolution settings, your experiences will certainly vary. But overall, as a technology now, it's certainly a lot more solid. And for my personal experience, I would much rather play Wolfenstein Youngblood on, let's say, an RTX 2060 with DLSS enabled, hardware-based ray tracing enabled, or Control with pretty much the same setup, than not having hardware-based ray tracing, because to me, there is a fundamental shift in what hardware-based ray tracing brings to the table. And this is why, of course, AMD are adopting it with their next generation of RDNA, along with other technologies which are also, of course, included in Turing, like variable rate shading. I believe that AI upsampling is going to be of critical importance, not just for Nvidia cards, but also AMD GPUs in the future, and we've already seen hints of this for what Microsoft have revealed about the Xbox Series X, whereas Nvidia runs the code, that is, of course, on the Tensor Cores, AMD seems to be able to run it on the traditional streaming processors of their GPU, that is the compute units, and it seems to run at a lower precision. It looks like it's either 4 or 8-bit operations. How much this impacts and improves performance, well, we can only wait and see, because obviously we've not seen anything officially from AMD about that, and clearly the Xbox is not released yet, so developers are still being extremely cagey about its capabilities. But that's getting way outside the topic of this video. What is inside the topic of this video is DLSS 2, and it, to me, has improved immeasurably over the original implementation. I think it's going to take another year or so before we see almost completely perfect results. But I've got to say, in Wolfenstein, for example, I would say that 99% of people, if you're playing like a fast-paced action scene, would be unable to tell if DLSS was running at the quality setting anyway, maybe if you're going with the lower setting, versus the same settings but with a native output. I would be very interested to do some blind comparisons with that. Anyway, hopefully though you have enjoyed the video. The normal stuff if you did, like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.